welcome everybody to today's seminar, Legal Tools for Managing Cross-Border Risk in a COVID-19 World. Well, I'm sure you've all got an interest in what's going on in China and what legal tools are here that you can use in order to manage the various problems that are arising as a result of this COVID-19 crisis. And to share their thoughts with you, I'm going to introduce my colleagues, Simon Chan, the head of our Hong Kong office of Dorsey, and Ray Liu, the head of our Beijing office of Dorsey. Just to introduce Simon and Ray quite briefly, Simon is also head of the M&A practice in Hong Kong. He's licensed to practice law in New York and Hong Kong. He's been practicing for the last 25 years in both the U.S. and Hong Kong. And he specializes in, as well as advising his clients on transactions, but taking a multidisciplinary and multi-jurisdictional approach to help with VUCA situations. And we'll soon let you know what VUCA is all about. In addition to all that, he likes to strum his guitar at times, so please drop by and have a sing-along one day. Ray, who's head of our Beijing office, was recently named China Business Law Journal's A-list member, one of the top 100 elite China lawyers. He's admitted to practice in the state of New York, and he also has a PRC legal qualification and securities practice qualification. Now, Ray concentrates on cross-border dispute resolution and on U.S. litigation and on arbitration. He's been doing also quite a lot of investigations and compliance-related work. In addition to all that, he finds time to do cross-border investment and international trade transactions. Before joining Dorsey, Ray was an in-house counsel in Bank of China's New York office. I'm Peter Corne. I'm head of our Shanghai office, long-term resident of China. I specialize in transactions and in mediation and arbitration. Okay, well, let's launch into the seminar. Well, as everybody's probably guessed, this is the ultimate complex situation to manage, what we call a VUCA situation: volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. In other words, the perfect legal storm. So, in the perfect legal storm, are there legal tools to help you through it? Well, we think there are, and we've been helping our clients manage their way through this mess through the last several months in China. And as you know, the whole crisis started earlier in China, hence we've had a little bit more experience in managing these issues. So the three key points that we're going to talk about today are: what financial relief is available to help your business through the COVID-19 crisis, and how do you access it? The second part will focus on how do you position your business to get the most benefit out of force majeure clauses in your contracts. And lastly, we're going to address the issue, how do you best manage the impact of government-imposed COVID-19 measures and associated employment issues. Okay, well, I'm going to launch the first topic, which is financial relief. First of all, I'm going to get Ray and Simon, who I haven't allowed to say a peep yet. Hi. So Ray and Simon, say hello for our audience.
Hey, this is Simon. Good morning, America. Good afternoon in Europe, and good evening in Asia. Hope you're all staying safe and healthy. Thank you for tuning in.
Thanks, Simon. This is Ray Liu, live from Beijing. Nice to meet everyone through this webinar. Look forward to discussing all of these intriguing and important topics with you. Thank you.
Okay, well, we're going to put Ray and Simon on the spot today, see if they can come up with the goods. So let's shoot them some questions, shall we? And the first ones are going to be on financial relief. So Ray and Simon, what sort of financial relief has been made available to business in this part of the world? And by whom? What sort of relief is there from, taxes, local rates, government fees? And what about financial support? Are there low-interest loans available? How widespread are they? And are there any relief from other sort of costs like utility fees or rental costs? And how convenient is access to government functions these days? Are government really responsive? And do they even provide data to help businesses more than they did before? And to what extent are they trying to get consumers spending more money in order to resuscitate the Chinese and Hong Kong economies? Okay, I'd like you to lead off today, Simon, so please take it away.
Sure, Peter, thank you. So that's a lot of questions. So I'm going to maybe start with an overview about the Hong Kong approach. I believe it will set a scene, a contrasting scene between Hong Kong and China as to what's happening. So the overview scene, and you can see this on page 8 of my slide, is Hong Kong is a laissez-faire economy, as you all know, and as such, the financial relief, while it's being pushed by the Hong Kong government, private sector is also doing something. But since Hong Kong is a laissez-faire economy, the government cannot direct or tell what private sectors do to help with the situation. So, for example, the government can't tell the bank to say, hey, you got to slash down interest rate for borrowers. But let's look at some of the bullet points I teed up on slide 8. So the Hong Kong government, on the government side, did push out a relief package worth 30 billion Hong Kong dollars. In U.S. dollars, that's around slightly under $4 billion. That's tiny compared to what the U.S. has just released. Some of these, it's called the Anti-Epidemic Fund. It's one-off. It's meant to be a relief injection into sectors such as retail, F&B, transportation, arts, culture, and tourism. And obviously, a chunk of that cash will go into the public hospitals for mass production, as well as the supplies that's needed for hospitals here in Hong Kong to deal with the situation. And Peter, you asked about stimulus to get consumers to start spending money again. Well, the Hong Kong government, it's going to be giving out $10,000 worth of cash. That's around, I believe, $1,200 US to all permanent residents in Hong Kong over 18 years of age. They will get this cash. It's meant to help them buy masks, buy hand sanitizers, and just to help people get through with these times. On the next slide, I did a snapshot in slide 9 as to a quote, as well as I picked it up from the government website as to how they're going to divide up the 30 million. So this is just a small snapshot. There are 12 other little blue boxes with what they will be doing. Like what I'm seeing and reading about in most countries and with most governments, they've announced these measures, but we're still looking at what they will be doing, the details as to how companies or citizens will be able to get these funds. So lastly, I'm going to leave off with a slide on page 10, which I've listed out the tax savings or waiver of business registration fees for this year, so that these are little things that the Hong Kong government is doing to help the economy and people in Hong Kong to get through this time. When I started to talk about the financial relief, I talked about the government side as well as the private side. So on the private side, I mentioned earlier, the government can't tell what the banks can do, can't tell what commercial landlords can do, but at the same time, the industries have gotten together, led by either, for example, the bank, the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, or with commercial landlords. They've been talking to different industries, such as the F&B industries or the retail industry, as to what they need. So for the banks, there has been now SME loan lending initiatives to get money out to small, medium-sized enterprises faster, and they're supposed to be at low interest rate. Having said that, the environment is already low interest rate, so we'll see how the market will react to the interest rate with these loan programs. And on the other side, the commercial landlords, these are private landlords. Some of them I've seen in the market that they've offered lower rents as a relief to their tenants in the retail or F&B sectors. I do foresee that more and more of these similar measures will be rolled out by the private sector in Hong Kong. But once again, I do want to end on the note that Hong Kong is a laissez-faire free economy. So as such, there is no government directives as to how the banks or the private sector will be doing. But this is all out of our own initiative as to what we're doing. So back to you, Peter.
Thanks, Simon. And Ray, how does this approach contrast with what's going on in mainland China? Obviously, you've got a lot bigger territory to cover, but the systems actually are in stark contrast, right, with the way that they've handled these things from a financial incentive perspective.
Yes, indeed, Peter. Thanks for raising this. Well, certainly we're talking about a country of the same size of territory of the United States with 1.4 billion people. And the outbreak started in late January, probably around the Spring Festival time period this year. So it's a big challenge for the entire country. So on page 12, you can see that in mainland China is seriously a top-down approach. Certainly there are policies and financial reliefs and all kinds of incentive programs released and the directive launched by the national level government agencies and then to the local government authorities. And certainly that has been a kind of a trend that we have been seeing starting from late January till now. So starting from page 13 all the way till page 16, well, we're not going to go through each one of those policies because there are too many of them. But we just want to quickly mention that because in case our multinational companies and our friends and contacts who have China operations in those geographic locations all across China, our recommendation is that we need to keep very close track of all of the latest policies and incentive programs so as to make the best of them, right? For example, the sector do matters and the location do matters because all of those policies have been rolled out gradually, especially now situations in China have been normalizing and the Chinese government and also all the local authorities have been gradually encouraging the business to get back to work and try to have the business reopen. So get back to your question, Peter. In terms of the relief from taxes, rates, and the government fees, page 17 to page 19, we will be just sort of give the audience a sense of what these programs are. Yes, indeed. Let's say the exemption of taxes, certain tax reliefs for, let's say, for value-added tax, VAT, or from income tax have been offered to basically four groups of recipients. For example, for the medical professional who are engaged to control and combat the COVID-19 situation, and also in the U.S. we'll call it, the essential businesses or the manufacturers or some of the essential part of the social and economic life. Those need to be encouraged to keep the economy going. So we have been seeing some of the tax benefits in this regard, and also encouraging the donations, as page 18 shows, as well as as page 19 has shown that right now China has been gradually moving toward the resumption work and production phases. So we've been seeing that from a tax perspective, some of the policy to launch, for example, a rollover period, and also some of the exemption of taxes, not only in Hubei, the early epicenter in China, but also in some other provinces and areas. So, Peter, you mentioned financial support and the loan interest rates. So page 20 should just give you a sense of, the mainland China approach, right? So you will not see, the central bank mandate directly, how many percentage of the loan cut, the interest cut, they're going to direct the local commercial banks, but it did issue policy basically requiring banks to reasonably extend loan repayment schedules and effectively reduce the interest rate, and also basically borrowers, as recommended by the PBOC, People's Bank of China, the central bank, they're encouraged to give some of the incentive program to allow the borrowers to apply for extension of the repayment loan, for example, for a period no longer than a year. So all of these efforts and policies are helpful. So next slide, page 21, you will see that all of those commercial banks, basically, as you can see, we have been listing some of the banks here, BOC, ICBC, ABC, CCB, BOCOM. Basically, these are the top 5 commercial banks, including China Merchant Bank and Citibank. All of those mainstream commercial banks have been adopting a pretty attractive policies incentive to offer some financial relief. For example, by cutting the interest rate for commercial loans for small and medium businesses and individual businesses by 0.5%, and those have been proven to be pretty effective and well received. So on page 22, on the rental cost, as Peter and Simon mentioned, in mainland China, there's actually no national policies, right? But the local authorities did release guidelines on, relief of rental costs, for example, for some major cities like Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen, and also for Guangzhou province. For state-owned enterprises, for those state-owned business-owned properties, some exemption or rental cost of up to 50% have been offered, depending on the situation. And also some of the private land developers are voluntarily offering discount rental deduction to help the situation. So lastly, on page 23, while there's no cash stimulus plan as we have seen in the States and in Hong Kong as they are, but there are some other variations in mainland China, like consumer voucher. You have to register by your phone online. It's kind of a lottery system, first come, first served. So this is kind of an interesting contracts, I would say. So I'll pause here, Peter. Hand it over to you.
Thanks. This all sounds really good, Ray. But how do our clients actually access these incentives? Is there national treatment? Are they treated the same irrespective of whether they're foreign-owned or Chinese-owned? And how convenient is to actually get these incentives?
Thanks, Peter. On mainland China part, it's actually, foreigners or foreign invested enterprises and domestic companies have been treated equally, and those incentive programs and reliefs have been accessible to all the businesses and the individuals. So our recommendation is that we have to be proactive. We have to be keeping track of all of those policies. For business operations, like China operations, we recommend the on-the-ground folks to stay in touch and consult with those commercial banks, tax authorities, government agencies, and even the landlord, just to keep track of all of this. So, Peter.
Let's move on to the core part of this seminar, which is about force majeure. I'm sure you've been all waiting on the edge of your seats to see how you can invoke force majeure in China and in Hong Kong. So we want to really look at what is force majeure and how can it help you in this situation? And how do you work out if force majeure actually covers COVID-19 situation and the government measures around it? And to what extent must performance be affected to be covered by force majeure? And what if your contracts don't even have a force majeure clause? Simon, do you want to lead off on this? This is going to be interesting because we're juxtaposing common law system and civil law system here. Go ahead, Simon.
Sure. Yes, sure, Peter. So for the audience dialing in from the U.S., from the U.K., and other common law jurisdictions, this will sound very familiar to you. So what is force majeure? So it's defined on my slide 25 as giving an excuse a party from performing or even maybe altering the terms of a contract upon the occurrence of a materially impactful and unforeseeable event beyond the party's control. So that is a typical common law concept. But perhaps I'm going to take you through the slide after this one and set the scene on how you can trigger the force majeure clause under the Hong Kong common law context. So prior to COVID-19, I believe many contracts will not be talking about COVID-19 or an epidemic or pandemic. Why I say that is in Hong Kong and in the Hong Kong and the UK common law concept to trigger a force majeure or for a force majeure to be operational and enforceable, it needs to be very expressed and specific. So as such, on my slide on page 26, various governments, especially the Chinese government, has declared that COVID-19 is an unforeseeable, unavoidable, and insurmountable event. So I'm going to maybe leave Ray Liu to talk about what the PRC government has declared. Why I mention this here is because it is very useful, because a lot of multinationals dealing with China, dealing with Asia, they will often sign contracts between the U.S. or the European countries with China, but often the contracts governed by Hong Kong law. So as such, these declarations by the PRC government or other governments will be important when you tee up what's next, and I'll talk about what's next on my next slide. But I do want to also talk about that the World Health Organization also declared that, first of all, it started out as a public health emergency of concern, and on March 11, WHO declared that COVID is a pandemic. So all this will help. So parties wanting to enforce or make use of force majeure, you won't have to rebuild all the evidence to show the other side or the court what has happened and whether that falls within force majeure. So that all sounds very helpful. But here's what's next, and I call it the Hong Kong force majeure tool, and what you should be looking for on my next slide here on slide 27 is force majeure clauses requires precise language. Here's the principle. This is the common law contract principle, whereby the party's intent must be contained in the four corners of the contract. So as such, you got to find the force majeure clause and the situation within the contract, and whether the force majeure clause expressly contemplates an epidemic or health crisis situation. Just before this, I looked at various samples of force majeure clauses. I must say most of them don't touch upon epidemic or health crisis situation. The closest one two closest ones I found based on maybe a couple of samples I looked at would be act of God or contamination of a nuclear event. It does not talk about viral or bacteria epidemics or health crisis. If any one of you have seen what a force majeure which covers something like this, do send an email to me or Dorsey. I would love to have a chat with you about this to take a look at your sample. But potentially, if you can find a catch-all clause in the force majeure clause that can help you potentially in the force majeure, if it says, hey, if the event impacts on travel, transportation, manufacturing, quarantine, etc., that can potentially be something that can be relied on to enforce a force majeure or to cite it as an event for the party that you're dealing with that a force majeure event has happened. So I'm going to rush through the slides because I'm taking up too much time of Ray's time to cover China. But for Hong Kong, a notice needs to be given to the other side, and the burden of proof will be on the party that's seeking to enforce and invoke the force majeure clause. So these slides are contained in my slide 28, 29, to wrap it up to set the scene for the China situation. Pass it on to you, Ray.
Thanks a lot, Simon. I think that's a very interesting comparison. So let me share with the audience and the group that what PRC law, the mainland China law, says. On page 33, I think that will set the tone because, as Peter mentioned, China is a civil law jurisdiction, not a common law. It's not case law interpreted. So what it really matters is what the statute says, right? So the applicable statutes and laws are PRC contract law and the general principles of civil law. So you have to understand, what the law says about a force majeure event to start the conversation. So it refers to an objective event or circumstance that is, here are three magic words: unforeseeable, unavoidable, and insurmountable. So these are what the statute says, which are truly important as sort of the goal criteria in determining a true force majeure event. So in practice, it will usually typically include, natural disaster, wars, government actions, let's say the quarantine or, the stay-at-home order or shelter-in-place order, and some other social anomalies. So let me be clear, right? If there's the force majeure event, it does not necessarily mean that, a party who could not perform the contract will be sort of exempted from liability. It still has to satisfy a number of criteria, which will lead to page 34. So once again, page 34, you see force majeure is a statutory exemption, right? It's a statutory exemption. But we can still have a force majeure clause, right? So if we choose to include a force majeure clause in our contract, what we can do is that we can try to expand or specify the scope of the force majeure events by mutual agreement, right? You can say it specifically covers, let's say, public health emergency, disease, epidemic, pandemic, you name it, or other related government measures taken to combat or to counter that situation. So that will give you a layer of protection, and I'll come back to that point later. But let's say a contract was signed before all of the outbreaks happened, but what if a contract does not contain a force majeure clause? But like I said, it's a statutory exemption. We have the statute, so the court will make its own judgment and use its own discretion in accordance with the default rules in relevant laws and regulations. So turn to page 35. So as I mentioned, it's not a slam dunk or a home run. If you can prove a force majeure event, there's a number of things you have to prove, and I'll come back to this detailed element. But essentially, the contract performance has to be, quote unquote, prevented, hindered, or delayed because of or by the occurrence of the force majeure event, right? So these are truly important, and the court will make its judgment based on that. Of course, besides the possibility of being exempted from, not be able to perform the contract, you can also terminate the contract based on the force majeure clause if the contract purpose, will be frustrated or cannot be achieved. You can certainly certainly use the statutory right to terminate the contract. But what if the contract is terminated? How about, let's say, the losses incurred already? Well, we'll go back to the last point of the page 35, which is what we call loss allocation, right? The PRC court, under the sort of civil law principle of fairness, will look into the situation and allocate the costs, let's say in a court proceeding. It's not necessarily 50-50%, right? It will be sort of subject to the discretionary decision of the court. So turn to page 36. This is exactly the elements I was alluding to, right? So it both cover the burden of proof, also the statutory requirements in order to be exempted from from being liable for, let's say, a breach of contract based on the contractual clauses, right? So once again, as I mentioned, unforeseeable, unavoidable, and insurmountable. You have to prove that it's indeed a force majeure event, and you have to establish causation. And similar to Hong Kong situation, right? You have to give notice in a timely manner about the force majeure event, and you have to provide evidence. And similar to Hong Kong, you also need to take reasonable approaches and steps to mitigate damages, right? So, as I mentioned, you can terminate the contract by sending a notice, but the other party, once they receive the notice, they can object within a certain period of time, or you might also be able to, let's say, sue them in court, try to seek a declaratory judgment, and the other party might join the proceeding and let the court decide. Okay, so turn to page 37. A lot of our multinational clients ask about this so-called CCPIT certificate, right? So there's a counterparty, so for example, a supplier in China sent us this saying that, because of the COVID-19 situation, we're not going to be able to timely deliver your products. And what is this CCPIT certificate about? Well, actually, it's in a nutshell, it's issued by a government-sponsored entity, but it's not a government authority, as a proof of objective facts, right? So it's just to prove, let's say, for example, on this slide, you can see there's example, right? It just say something like, indeed, something happened, right? Say there's postponement or there's a government measure taken. It's just to prove certain facts, right? So page 38 will give you a better sense of what I'm talking about. So basically, it's not conclusive evidence that if you got a CCPIT certificate issued, it's a force majeure event proven. Not at all, even under PRC law, right? You still have to establish the statutory requirements, as I just mentioned. And also, we have listed some of the New York law and UK law cases and findings that, it's not a slam dunk situation. It's helpful in terms of proving certain facts, but you still have to prove that it's a force majeure event, and you still have to prove that, your liability can be exempted based on the statutory requirements under PRC law. Yep. So, Peter, I will pause here to see if you have any questions.
Yeah, thanks, Ray. Thanks, Simon. I'm just interested to know what happens after you invoke force majeure in Hong Kong and the PRC, and say one party has already performed, or performance has merely been delayed and it's still possible to perform the contract later. How does that affect the strategy here?
Thanks, Peter. So for Hong Kong, if the force majeure event only impacts part of the contract, you still have to perform the other part of the contract that has not been impacted by the force majeure event. And also, if the event only delays the performance, unless there's precise language, say even delaying the performance is a force majeure event, it will not be a force majeure event. Generally speaking, the law would interpret it as it needs to make the performance impossible before force majeure can be triggered under Hong Kong law.
Right.
Right.
Well, under PRC law, if let's say one party has performed already, and the force majeure has been invoked, the party may request the other party to provide reasonable compensation or share certain losses in accordance with the principle of fairness. Remember, I mentioned the loss allocation principle and a mechanism here, because that's basically what PRC contract law principle kicks in to address this issue. And if performance is merely delayed, or if the performance is only delayed due to a force majeure event, and the contract purpose has not been frustrated, so unless agreed by both parties, contracting parties shall perform the contract after a force majeure event is eliminated. Let's say the COVID-19 situation is over. Otherwise, there will be liabilities for breaching the contract. In a nutshell, Peter.
Right, Ray. Just a follow-up question. Are there any alternatives to force majeure? I've heard in certain civil law jurisdictions you have a doctrine called the doctrine of changed circumstances. Is that useful in this context? Is it available?
A great question, Peter. Yes, indeed, it is absolutely available, and this is certainly an option here. So let's turn to page 39. It might sound a little bit odd to our common law jurisdiction practitioners, but there's indeed a principle called change of circumstances under PRC law. In a nutshell, basically is triggered by the material change of circumstances after contract being formed. So it's unenforceable, which is similar to force majeure event, but the court had decided to name it as not caused by a force majeure event, not caused by a commercial risk, but if you let the party perform the contract, it will be materially or obviously unfair to a party, or the contract purpose will be frustrated. So in this situation, you have to file complaint to the court, or file arbitration application to the arbitration center, and let the court or tribunal to decide whether to modify or terminate the contract. So I would say it's an alternative, but just to scale back a little bit, right? So we can have force majeure clause, yes. If no, don't worry about it. It's a statutory exemption. The court will look at the statute to decide whether it's a force majeure. But let's say if the court said it's not a force majeure, you can still try to argue that there's indeed a change of circumstances. Can we have the contract modified or terminated? But of course, it's subject to the court and tribunal's discretionary decision making. So, back to our recommendation, we'll still recommend we actually put a force majeure clause and just to follow all of those procedures to prove that the liability could be exempted. Peter.
Okay, thanks, Ray. I think at this point it's time to move on to the next part of the webinar, which relates to risks under quarantine measures. And everyone knows about the draconian quarantine measures that have been enforced in the PRC. The situation, however, is a little bit different in Hong Kong, but irrespective of the form of those measures, we're very interested in what are the risks for businesses and individuals for not complying with these quarantine measures, and the implications for business if when you're implementing those measures in your company, your systems fail for some reason and you slip up. So Ray and Simon, maybe Simon you could lead off a bit, just if you could address these issues and give us a sense about what's happening in Hong Kong and the risks involved and how you can address those risks.
Thank you, Peter. Sure. So for the Hong Kong situation, it's interesting. Hong Kong, it's a little bit like the canary bird in a coal mine, whereas as you all know, Hong Kong is within China, but yet it's outside of China. Sometimes that's why we see things a little bit ahead and see things for the rest of the world a little bit ahead as well. Having said that, I'm going to dive right into the quarantine measures and the impact. Hong Kong so far has very limited quarantine measures compared to Wuhan, the rest of China, Europe, the United States, and the rest of the world. As of today, right now, there is still no government city order to stop commercial activities or to require people to stay at home. So in a way, I only have 2 slides. So Peter, when you guys asked me to, hey, can you add a little bit more slides on this in Hong Kong? I just don't have that much to add so far. As to the impact, there is some impact as to some quarantine measures that has been taking place in the very early days of COVID-19. So I'm going to start to talk about what I call phase 1 quarantine measures and also phase 2 quarantine measures, and in a way, as I was describing how Hong Kong is the canary bird in the coal mine, because Hong Kong saw the first wave of COVID, and now we are kind of seeing the second wave of COVID coming back a little bit ahead of many outbreak zones right now in the world. So with the phase 1, which began end of January, basically Hong Kong closed its borders and links with China to stop the spread of the virus from coming in from China. So it didn't stop everything. It definitely limited 90% of the access and borders and transportation links between Hong Kong and mainland China. And as of February 8th and all the way till now, Hong Kong government issued a compulsory 14 days quarantine order for anyone, regardless of nationality, arriving from mainland China. So I talked about the second phase of quarantine in the reaction to the second wave of new cases that's now popping up in Hong Kong. Just to share with you a little bit of information here, for the first 2 months, the new cases of COVID, we did get new COVID cases, but they were relatively low. They were only a handful. With wave 2, in the last 7 days, the new cases have double, triple. On average, each day, Hong Kong's been getting maybe 25 to 50. That right now I know sounds small, but with a population of 7 million, that number has taken us from around less than 100 COVID cases to now around and over 400 cases. So that jumped quite a bit in the last couple of days. So as such, as of today, no Hong Kong non-resident can arrive by air from any location into Hong Kong for the next 14 days. So basically, we're closing our borders. And for non-Hong Kong residents arriving from China, Macau, Taiwan, coming into Hong Kong, there's going to be a compulsory 14 days compulsory quarantine measure, and whereby the government, as soon as you pass these health check borders, they will issue a digital device on your wrist whereby they can track your activities. Either you'll be ordered to stay home for your compulsory quarantine, or if the health authorities think that you're a high-risk case, they would put you into government facilities for quarantine. So far, as I said, there's no city government order to shut down the city or slow down or even close commercial activities. Schools have been closed, and I'll end this note by adding an interesting point which only was announced 48 hours ago. Hong Kong government will be introducing laws to ban alcohol from the 8,000 restaurants and bars in Hong Kong. So that's something to me quite interesting, as to banning alcohol to stop COVID-19. Back to you, Peter and Ray.
Okay, Ray, I know the situation's vastly different in the mainland. What has been the risk for non-compliance with these orders that have been taken, and the implication if systems fail?
Right. Thanks, Peter. Just to give our audience a little bit background here. So when we're talking about the measures or the quarantine, which actually started on January 23rd, when Chinese authorities placed the basically 11 million people in the city of Wuhan under quarantine, and then the rest of the Hubei province days later, basically totaling a population of 60 million people, 60 million residents in quarantine. It's pretty aggressive measures, but effective. In March, afterwards, it basically fast-tracked 2 months later. Now, given the epidemic situation or the pandemic situation in mainland China have been pretty effectively controlled, and right now, basically, there's been almost no local originated confirmed cases for a while. So the government, including the central government and the local governments, have been gradually shifting their focuses to the prevention of some of the import cases and focusing on opening up the business and getting the economy back to normal. Having said that, travel restrictions, quarantine measures, and some other government initiated measures have not been fully lifted yet in mainland China. So we still have to keep track of all of those measures and bear in mind to comply with those. So good question on the risks for the business individuals for non-compliance. Yes, there certainly are risks from the legal and regulatory perspective. So let's focus on the page 47 for a minute. Obviously, it is actually required for all the businesses and individuals in mainland China to comply with those quarantine measures, because according to labor law, employment contract law, or prevention and treatment of contagious diseases law, all of the employers in China, including multinational companies, China operations, plant and facilities, and office facilities, to provide a safe working environment to its employees. It's actually said so in the statute. And also, all the employers have to timely report any confirmed and suspected infection of COVID-19 situation or some of the symptoms of employees to medical institutions or disease prevention and control organization. And also have to cooperate with requests from medical institutions or disease prevention and control organizations in preventing and curbing the spread of the COVID-19. So, and of course, there's some other legal and regulatory basis to keep in mind. So when you look at this, the potential consequences for non-compliance, these are pretty serious, right? For business provider, for businesses, if there's a non-compliance to a certain level, it could be sort of facing a shutdown by the authority. The business license could be revoked, and we've been seeing some, cases whereby some of the business got fined, right? For individuals, of course, you'll be warned by the police if you fail to comply with the quarantine measures, even administrative detention, even criminal liabilities. For example, in some of the cases, some of the confirmed cases, some of the patients, they lied, failed to disclose the situation and the symptom, and failed to disclose the travel history of those individuals, which led to some of the outbreak or some of the contagious events, and also, a cancellation of foreigners' residence permit, and some of the foreigners can be forced to leave the country within a certain time limit. So these are the potential consequences we have to keep in mind. Peter.
Thanks, Ray. Let's move on to the final section now, key workplace and employment issues. We'll turn to page 50 now. This again is a very contrasting area between Hong Kong and the PRC, reflection very much of the laissez-faire tradition in Hong Kong versus European style, almost European style labor laws in the PRC. But I did want to extend that and ask a little bit about the right of business to collect personal data for health purposes, because a lot of that's been going on, and whether or not it is permitted and whether businesses have to be careful about things like consent. So I'd like you both to address that first, but following on, I'd like you to summarize for me what the obligations of businesses are, when businesses have to suspend business operations under a government order, or how are you required to treat employees who have been infected, and is there any relief for paying Social Security payments? So, Simon, can you lead off again, please?
Sure, thanks, Peter. So the Hong Kong situation is different to what Ray is about to say. Is on collection of personal data, in light of COVID-19, nothing has changed. In fact, as you all know, Hong Kong observes what is similar to the other Western jurisdictions, whereby it has very strict personal data privacy laws governed by the Personal Data Privacy Ordinance. In light of COVID-19, how government, how, say, transportation companies, a shopping mall, or an employer, a company, or a building, how they're collecting this data, they still need to use the highest standard required by the Data Privacy Ordinance on how it's collected, used, analyzed, and managed with this data information. So on that front, that has not changed. So on the, let's say, fair approach as to workplace employment issue, this source, it's kind of a segue into what we were talking about with quarantine. In Hong Kong, there's still the opposite mentality so far that with the clients and businesses that we are talking to, and also the government, you get a sense that they're trying to stay open, with Hong Kong opening or staying open as a city that's open for business. So throughout the last 3 months, the stock exchange, most places to do business, the banks, we have not closed. But obviously, workplaces, companies, employers, or we have deployed measures to protect our clients and our staff and our colleagues in the community with different measures that we're using by ourselves. So again, back to the laissez-faire approach, it's a let-do approach whereby what we think is the right thing to do to protect our people. Just on a note which ties into the Hong Kong concept, with Hong Kong being a service industry economy, its core asset, it's human capital, and human capital equals people. So as such, COVID-19 does impact our people, the human capital. As such, we recommend proactive human capital management. Just to set the scene on what the Hong Kong law is, Hong Kong law hasn't changed as a result of, in employment law at least, hasn't changed as a result of COVID-19. Hong Kong is still an at-will employment law jurisdiction similar to many common law jurisdictions, but subject to statutory protection. Employment contracts are still renewed on a month-to-month basis. So as such, all these concepts remain. So as to protecting employees, protecting workforce during this kind of environment, since Hong Kong has gone through SARS, avian flu, swine flu, the Hong Kong government, Department of Health, does have different guidelines to help people on how we keep, or how business owners, employer, how we keep employees safe during this time of epidemic or pandemic situation. So on my slide 52, I list out a couple of guidelines that the Department of Health and Department of Labor has issued as to what employers should be doing. These are general concepts as to, for example, ensuring that the workplace and our staff has good personal hygiene, it's safe. And you asked me earlier today, what if an employee catches COVID-19? So that doesn't change. So under current common law and employment laws that have dealt with similar cases during SARS or avian flu, catching COVID-19 and under the current guidelines would be treated as this person's having caught a flu bug or it's sick. So as such, that just triggers the employment contract provisions or statutes as to how you treat, you pay this person who became sick. So nothing has so far changed, but again, this is a little bit back on the common law as well as laissez-faire approach, both interacting at the same time in the backdrop of COVID-19 situation. Thanks, Peter, and Ray, I'll set in on that.
Yeah, we've just got a few minutes, so I'd like Ray to have a chance to really point out the main features of the PRC system.
Okay, thanks, Peter and Simon. So let's turn to page 54. So just to set the tone, yes, Peter, PRC employment law is more pro-employee, right? So in terms of, as you asked, any limitation on the right of business to collect personal data for health purposes or public health purposes, well, actually the law is pretty much silent on this point. But whether especially for the question of whether prior consent from the employees needed is not sufficiently clear under the law, but it's still advisable to obtain prior consent from employees if possible, right? So turn to page 55. We provided some of the guidance or some of the recommendations we have. It depends on who actually collecting the data, right? If government collecting data tracking the travel history, there's nothing we can do about it. But as employers, right, as businesses, so we have to limit the scope of the information collected to minimum, to minimize the risks to the extent possible, refrain from using such data for other purposes, take measures necessary to protect the security of information, and carefully evaluate before disclosing or transferring the personal data to third parties. So let's turn to page 56. I'm mindful of the time, so we'll just go through some of the main issues pretty quickly. The quick answer to your question, Peter, yes, we still need to pay employees while we have, let's say, the business being suspended, right? Absent any special agreement between employer and employee, an employer, the business still needs to pay employees during the suspension, while different payroll rules might apply, as we have outlined here on page 56. So turn to page 57, right? In terms of how the law requires the business to treat employees who have infected with COVID-19. The short answer is, on page 57, the regular salary shall still need to be paid to employees during the quote-unquote quarantine medical treatment period, right? Employers may not terminate them based on the reasons provided by Article 40 and 41 of the PRC employment contract law, such as termination based on performance issues or restructuring of the business during such period of time. Expiring employment contract will be automatically extended until the end of such period. So as you can see, it's pretty much pro-employees to go through this pretty difficult time period. And turn to page 58. Yes, there's indeed some reliefs offered, for businesses for paying the Social Security payments from the government. Among others, following incentives, as we have outlined in the slide, have been implemented by the Chinese government for certain business. For example, offering reduction and exemption for certain social insurance contributions, granting grace period for social insurance and housing fund contributions, and lastly, providing incentives for retaining employees. So real quick, from page 61 to page 63, we have basically outlined some of the what we call best practices to prevent and control the workplace virus spread. I know that right now the business in China have been gradually returning back to work, resuming their work, but we cannot let our guard down. So we have provided some guidance and toolkits for the local businesses to keep in mind. On one hand, complying with the rules. On the other hand, trying to get the business going. So just focusing on the four major issues we have talked about, from financial support relief, making use of force majeure, and avoiding risks under Corne measures, and obligations to staff and taking advantage of payroll relief. So given this very difficult time period in mainland China and across the world, we recommend that we take proactive approach. We need to be proactive in terms of communicating with the relevant local government agencies, our business partners, and our employees, just to make sure we have sufficient communication channel open and efficient. And we need to collaborate more and get through this very difficult time period together. So, Simon.
Thanks, Ray. Yes, for the 4 topics, the key takeaway for Hong Kong would be, I call them the CCC, 3 Cs, which would be communications, collaboration, and care. Because based on previous case laws on SARS and based on policies and based on even the judiciary, the courts in Hong Kong facing COVID-19, I expect courts and tribunals will be sympathetic towards the situation. As such, communications, collaboration, and care with all stakeholders between opposing parties in a contract to employer-employee relationships or with the government, that will be key. Well, that's the end of our presentation.
Yep. Just to add a quick point to the takeaway point, we recommend our contacts and friends and clients to always comply with the local rules. Given this very difficult time period, it's unique, it's unforeseeable, but we're really seeing the light at the end of the tunnel.
I want to thank all of our audience for dialing in today. I'm sure you got a lot out of it. We certainly have by preparing this. And we invite you to send us any questions that you have to attendance@dorsey.com. And if you want CLE points, please sign and return the sign-in sheet to attendance@dorsey.com. So we look forward to receiving your questions, and we look forward to receiving your CLE points. So thank you very much today. It's certainly been a pleasure to address you. Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Ray, for all your pearls of wisdom. And we wish you all the best during this very difficult time. So thank you, everyone.